A question I've gotten quite a few times in my comment section is, what's the population of Arnor? And to that guy who keeps asking that question, I'm sorry, I don't know, I have no real way of knowing, and I might do a video on it one day, but it's pretty far down the list. But I want to say to you that I share your interest in things like that. Demography is one of my favourite things, not just in Middle-earth, but in real life as well. It is such a shame that Tolkien was always quite vague when it came to demography. He rarely gave out hard numbers. I say rarely because he didn't, but now Nature of Middle-earth has been published. Yes, Nature of Middle-earth, the unofficial 14th volume of the history of Middle-earth edited by Carl F. Hofstadter, containing many previously unpublished writings that J.R.R. Tolkien wrote in the last years of his life. I'm going to do a YouTube livestream on it very soon where I'll give out my thoughts on the book as a whole, but in the meantime, you should read it. This video is going to touch on one of the new things we learned from this book, the population of Númenor. So Númenor was raised as a reward for the Edain, who fought against Morgoth alone of all men. Following the War of Wrath, the Edain were in a bad state. The House of Beor had almost been entirely wiped out. The House of Haleth were always few in number and were often aloof of other peoples. The House of Hador, whilst suffering heavily, were still the most numerous of the Edain. As a result, the first Númenorians were largely Hadorians. The Beorians were a middling-sized minority, and there were a few of the Haladin, and in some legends even a few families of Druedain, although these would eventually die out or return to Middle-earth. This original population was described as being between 5 to 10,000 people, and these people migrated to Númenor with the help of Círdan and his ships. Now, this isn't actually new information. The 5 to 10,000 number appears in the Peoples of Middle-earth, and personally, I think the number is very, very plausible. The Edain were never as populous as the elves in Beleriand, and their homelands were destroyed, so it made sense to me that only 5 to 10,000 actually survived till the end of the First Age. However, the Nature of Middle-earth gives us a little more. It says that the 5 to 10,000 Edain was simply the first fleet, and that the migration to Númenor took about 50 years, in which the amount of people that eventually settled on the island would be between 200,000 to 350,000. This information is interesting to me. 200,000 to 350,000 people isn't that many when we look at it from a modern perspective. However, this many people becomes a lot when we realise that the Edain were almost wiped out during the wars against Morgoth. They were reduced to slaves, fugitives, and a small amount of people dwelling on the Isle of Balar. Could that have really consisted of as many as 350,000 people? I don't know, seems like a lot. The other possible explanation is that the Edain that lived in Eriador were also given the option to travel to Númenor. Whilst they didn't fight in the main war against Morgoth, they were still hostile to him, and that would explain where the numbers come from. Either way, Númenor's starting population is between 200,000 to 350,000 people. The maximum is the size of the city I live in. Try and guess what it is. It must be said, given that Númenor is allegedly around 170,000 to 180,000 square miles in size, or 435,000 to 450,000 square kilometers in size, it makes for a pretty sparsely populated island at first. If you're interested in comparisons, Númenor is somewhere between the size of Iraq and Cameroon. Our following information comes literally from 3 sentences. In the first sentence, Tolkien simply says this: after 1,000 years, the population seems not to have much exceeded 2 million. Alright, pretty simple. So by year 1000 of the Second Age, during the reign of Tar Aldarion, and when Sauron started fortifying Mordor, Númenor's population was about 2 million. That's not a huge amount of growth, especially for 1,000 years. However, one must take the lifespan of Númenorians into account. Whereas 1,000 years is a long time for normal men, it's about 6 to 7 generations for royal Númenorians and probably no more than 15 generations for normal Númenorians. So that explains why there wasn't a huge population growth. There really wasn't that much time relative to their lifespans. The second sentence is this: this was greatly increased later, but outlet was found in the Númenorian settlements in Middle-earth. This doesn't really tell us anything new. We know that the population obviously increased, and we know that Númenor started making permanent colonies in Middle-earth around 1200 of the Second Age, during the reign of Tar and Calamay. However, the word outlet may imply that Númenor began to deal with crowding or overpopulation as time went on. The last sentence is the juicy one. Before the downfall, the population of Númenor itself may have been as many as 15 million. 15 million. If you want to make a comparison, that's about the population of England in 1840, Spain in 1860, the Ottoman Empire in the late 1500s, and Japan in the 1400s. And keep in mind, that is explicitly Númenor itself. It doesn't count Númenor's colonies, some of which may have been inhabited for over 2,000 years at the time of the downfall of Númenor. It's very likely that places like Gondor and Arnor already had over 1 million Númenorian inhabitants at this point, and that's the faithful. They're the minority. The king's men had vast colonies in Umbar and lands far to the south, so who knows how many people lived there. Even with an extremely conservative estimate, you could say that there were probably at least 20 million Númenorians by the time of the downfall of Númenor. It really does make you realise just how powerful Númenor was by the end of the Second Age. They were a colonial power that wouldn't be out of place in the historical colonial powers of our own world. They weren't just superior physically, mentally, and technologically, they were also very numerous, with a vast pool of manpower that could be drawn not just from their home island, but from their vast colonies. If not for their ill-fated assault on Valinor, they would have easily dominated the world, becoming a global tyranny that could have lasted for millennia, provided the Valar did not get involved. And it also makes you realise that Eru Ilúvatar murdered like 15 million people in one go, which probably makes him the biggest mass murderer in the history of Arda. Seriously, I don't even know if Morgoth was able to pull those kinds of numbers. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. There's definitely more Nature of Middle-earth content to come, but like I said earlier, you should definitely buy it yourself if you're a hardcore fan. It's very interesting to see how Tolkien tried to make his world less mythic and more sciencey. Whether that would have been for better or worse, you be the judge. Thanks, farewell, and remember, stay tuned for a live stream in the near future.